The rise of totalitarian dictatorships is a direct result of World War I. World War I caused the disruption of Europe, that allows for totalitarianism to rear its head. And if you remember the definition of totalitarianism, it is complete control, economically, socially, politically, culturally, by one group over the entire society. And that totalitarianism first rears its head in the fascismo of Italy under Benito Mussolini. It will come forward under Nazism, under Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. It will also rear its head at the opposite end of the political spectrum in the Soviet Union under communism and Joseph Stalin. And it will also find itself coming to fruition, unfortunately, in the military junta of Japan during Imperial Japan in the 1930s. All of those are totalitarian dictatorships in which all control over society is wielded by one group, be it a dictator, a small military junta, whatever the group is. People do that, people engage in that kind of political system because they fear the freedom, the dislocation, the absolute disillusionment that was there in Europe post-World War I. Of course, throw in the economic dislocation caused by the American Great Depression as translated to Europe by the Hawley Smooth Tariff. You have the economic situation, the intellectual situation, and the overall situation in which totalitarian dictatorships can rise, be it Imperial Japan, communism, Nazism, or fascism. What is the response of the United States to this rise in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt? Franklin Roosevelt pursues a foreign policy, and it's an interesting one. First of all, there's an international conference right away in 1933 that's called to deal with the situation, the economic crisis happening in Europe. We're going to stabilize currency rates, it's all going to be great. At the London Conference of 1933, at the last minute, FDR pulls out and says, we're not going to be involved. Second, he sets up reciprocal trade agreements. These reciprocal trade agreements allow us to reduce our tariff barriers so that we can trade with other countries in the world. The reciprocal trade agreements are very important because it presages this idea, this concept that we're interrelating with the world. As isolationist as he was by dropping out of the London Conference, as involved as we are with the reciprocal trade agreements. We want to trade with the world. Seemingly a little traditional George Washington policy there. Finally, the good neighbor policy. We will pursue that same policy in Latin America. No more big stick intervention, no more moral intervention, no more dollar diplomacy. All of those banana republics will be given a breath of fresh air by Roosevelt with the good neighbor policy, where we'll trade and support democracy in Latin America. Very good, very positive. The problem is that we do not want to, as a country, we do not want to be involved in the growing war turmoil of Europe. We look to Europe and say, we got involved last time, it didn't work. In fact, there was a specific committee of the United States Congress put together, the NYE Committee, N-Y-E, that said the only thing that profited from World War I were rich Jewish bankers. And it was extraordinarily negative, but extraordinarily xenophobic for us to say, we don't want to be involved in the world because the last time we were, it all failed. Woodrow Wilson's peace failed. So we become isolationists, and we passed 3 acts in the 1930s. The Neutrality Acts, and the Neutrality Act of 1935 said, we will not send weapons to any nation at war. 1936 Neutrality Act, we will not send money to any nation at war. And 1937 Neutrality Act, we will not allow people to enter into those zones in Europe where people are fighting. These neutrality acts are brilliantly designed, 35, 36, 37, to keep us out of World War I. They're not smart. They're unintelligent, given the fascist dictators over in Europe, given those totalitarians who want to take over the world. They're brilliant if you want to stay out of World War I, because they won't allow us to get involved in a conflict like World War I. Well, World War II will not be, and is not, anything like World War I. Those totalitarians want to take over the world, and we're going to have to stop them. That's reflected in the quarantine speech. Keep racking up these identifications. The reciprocal trade agreements, the FDR bombshell at the London conference, the good neighbor policy, the neutrality acts of 35, 36, and 37, with the quarantine speech. And in the quarantine speech, Franklin Roosevelt essentially lays out the concept that we will go to war. This is in 1937. We will go to war. Now, the American people don't want to, but he looks and sees totalitarians. He says they have to be quarantined. They cannot be allowed to spread and control the world. We have to keep them contained. And that quarantine speech is brilliant because in 37, he knows, despite the neutrality acts, he knows everything going on in Europe, that we're going to go to war and stop them, especially Nazi Germany. He knows exactly what Adolf Hitler's about, and he knows exactly that we have to stop these people. He looks at the Japanese. The Japanese are doing horrific things in the rape of Nanking in 1937, for example, that are so horrific they cannot be spoken about. We know we're going to go to war. He knows the American people don't want it. And what you see for the next 4 years is a brilliant leadership by the president. Again, not giving away anything of my political bent. This is brilliant foreign policy leadership, getting the American people to go along with him to get him to the point of where we will go to war and stop these powers. Important is the fact that we don't get involved when we couldn't. The Spanish Civil War, nationalist democratic Spain, taken over by Francisco Franco, the fascist, 1936 to 1939. What is our involvement in the fact that the nationally elected Democrats in Spain are being taken over by the fascist dictator Franco? Nothing. We refuse to get involved. And what happens to Spain? It turns fascist. Very importantly, might as well go to what's happening in Germany. And the Germans want Lebensraum. Lebensraum. Lebensraum is that living space that Nazi Germany says they need in order to have the fruition of the Third Reich. And frankly, they're looking to Eastern Europe. And frankly, they're going to get it and get it well. The first step that they have is the Ausgleich. And that is when they go to Austria and they say, let's now join together and become one country. Well, some Austrians, being German-speaking and all that, say, yes, that's a good idea. Others say no. And yet the joining together, the coming together of Germany and Austria is the first step to get that Eastern European realm within Nazi control, so they have the farmland to produce for the good, glorious Aryans there sitting in Nazi Germany. Some Austrians don't like it. In fact, that might serve as the basis of one of the great movies of all time, where certain Austrians resist those bad Germans, those bad Nazis coming down, especially if they're led by beautiful women like Julie Andrews singing wonderful songs like My Favorite Things. So that joining together of Austria, that taking over of Austria in the Anschluss, is this incredible thing, ANSCHLUSS, where Austria's taken over. Well, what's next? The next step, Czechoslovakia. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson, for creating a country called Czechoslovakia. Sorry that you had to put a whole bunch of Germans in Czechoslovakia, because to defend Czechoslovakia, you have to have the Sudetenland. Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is that area of Czechoslovakia that's filled with Germans. And he said, well, it's ours. Hitler says, we want Sudetenland that's filled with Germans. Now, the people in Europe don't want to go to war. We don't want World War I again. So the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, calls a conference in Munich.